The reputation of countries is part and parcel with their national security. We were led to believe over the years that national security is only a function of military strength or economic might, but we also learned in recent years, especially since the rise of social media and the internet, that national reputation is a big part of your national security because of the importance of the power of attraction and the power of persuasion. The late Harvard professor Joseph Nye coined the term soft power to describe exactly that. Soft power is the power that you deploy by persuasion to make others to do what you want them to do, not by using force. You know, the late legendary Israeli foreign minister Abba Eban, who was born in South Africa and raised in Britain, used to say whenever asked, "What's your definition of diplomacy?" he said, "It's the art of telling people to go to hell in such a way that they respond, 'When is the next bus leaving?'" So obviously, a central institution like the Hebrew University, that is really the father and the mother of Israel's academic prowess, is central and critical to fortify, if you may, Israel's reputation. And why? Because it adds to Israel's resilience. We are now facing a unique moment in the history of civilization. Since the beginning of 2024, there's an effort made by the United States to reintroduce a new world order for the first time since the end of World War II. And that creates a major incident of what we call geopolitical uncertainty. Geopolitical uncertainty occurs when the assumptions and the conditions that we used to predict the future and to design our policies had been disrupted dramatically. And that basically deprives actors, nations, multinational corporations, and other decision makers, deprives them of the ability to assess intelligently and to make predictions. So what do? So obviously you have the usual crisis management tools, diversify, shorten your supply chain, blah, blah, blah. But when it comes to nations, it's develop resilience. How do you develop resilience? By investing more, doubling down on your knowledge-based economy. And the Hebrew University has been a leader, not just an Israeli leader. It is the university that other universities emerged from. It was the inspiration to the entire Israeli academic establishment. But it's also globally a voice to be reckoned with. It's one of the top universities in the world. So as long as we can in Israel to continue to produce knowledge that matters, knowledge that changes life. I just read a wonderful interview with Professor Ben Neryah from the Hebrew University about a cancer treatment. As long as we can do that, then we will continue to be resilient in the face of the stormy waters of international relations. My family came to Jerusalem in the 1870s from what is today Uzbekistan. My great-grandfather, Rabbi Emanuel Aronoff, was the first Ole, the first newcomer from Bukhara to walk. He came by foot to Jerusalem. And he was one of the builders of the Bukharian neighborhood in Jerusalem, which is one of the few neighborhoods that were built outside of the old city after Yemin Moshe. Yemin Moshe was the first that was built in 1860 by Sir Moses Montefiore. So my family's connection to Jerusalem goes many, many years. And of course, the fact that I am part of that family, part of that legacy, is very, very meaningful to me. I attended the Hebrew University myself as part of a special program for diplomats, although I did not earn any degree from the Hebrew University, but I learned a great deal from the excellent professors that we had. So I know the university very well. On top of it, my wife's family has been involved with the Hebrew University for many, many years, and her grandfather, the great Lou Boyer, was one of the greatest Zionists of North America, was in charge of the campaign to raise all the money for the campus in Mount Scopus, for which he received the honorary doctorate along with Yitzhak Rabin in 1968. So if you have any complaints about the difficulty of navigating in the Mount Scopus campus, come to me and my family. I guess my wife's grandfather is to be blamed. But there's also a beautiful overseas students building named after him, the Boyer Building in Mount Scopus. So my connection is very, very deep to the university, not to mention the fact that I made the introduction to Jose Mugrabi, that is underwriting the entire Albert Einstein Museum, the new home for the 80,000 documents that Albert Einstein left the Hebrew University. So for me, this is really personal. So one of the things I love about the Hebrew University is that everything is done with a certain degree of humility. So let me give you an example, and I'm not trying to bash any other university in North America, but I'm looking at the new buildings that are being built in universities in New York. These buildings are being built by the top architects of the world. These are cutting edge buildings that are costing billions and billions of dollars. And you ask yourself, what for? Why can't we produce the same knowledge from a much more humble facility? And that's what you see when you walk the corridors of the campus, especially Givat Ram, but also Mount Scopus. When you walk the university hospital, Hadassah, and you see the accommodations are not the best in the world, but the level of science is the best in the world. That's what the most important thing. And so when you ask me, what makes me feel so good about it is the fact that it's being done with very small budget, with the help of great people like the Canadian Friends of the Hebrew University, with the help of young scientists that, despite of the fact that they have more lucrative offers from other universities overseas, decide to stay and promote Israeli science and promote Israeli knowledge. That's very Israeli to me. So world Jewry, and especially North American Jewry, uh, has uh, has been effective and has been critical to Israel's success from the very beginning. It's important to remind our viewers and our listeners that Zionism did not catch on in its early days. When the presages of Zionism entertained the idea of the return of Jewish independence in the Holy Land in mid-19th century, they were not called, they were not responded by the masses. And even Theodor Herzl, whose genius was the ability to create political Zionism, to turn this conceptual, abstract idea into a political reality, that was his genius. Even Theodor Herzl was unable to draw the masses behind him. Chaim Weizmann, who took the baton of Herzl and continued to serve as the face of the Zionist movement globally again, didn't. And so while 2.3 million Jews left Eastern Europe and came to North America, US and Canada, only a handful of Jews, like my family, chose to come to the Holy Land. And so in the early days of pre-statehood, and look even at the specific history of how the Hebrew University was created, the money was raised from to begin with overseas. And the university started by renowned Jews, the most famous Jews at the time, that gave their name and their reputation and their time to go and actively raise money for the university. So you're talking about Albert Einstein, you're talking about Sigmund Freud, you're talking about Martin Buber, you're talking about Yuda Leib Magnus, you're talking about Chaim Weizmann. all those great luminaries, they gave their name, their reputation, their fame in order to make this happen. And so nothing really has changed. The university is still relying on its friends. I know that the Canadian friends have several very interesting programs that advance science and collaboration between Canada and Israel. It's critically important. By the way, beyond the actual knowledge it produces, beyond the specific science, just the idea that Canada and Israel are connected through this wonderful program called IMRIC, I think is a great achievement. We need more of that. A lot of people feel a certain discomfort with what is happening in Israel with the prolonged war. And I've heard from some friends, even in the Canadian community, that people entertain thoughts of disengaging because they disagree with the government and so on. This is the point. This is the time to tell them, no, this is exactly the opposite of what you need to do. You need to engage even more, not divest, invest, reinvest, invest even more. This is when you are needed the most. The most effective tool that any institution in Israel has, including the Hebrew University, is to allow people to experience the place firsthand. So there you have the Board of Governors. That's an annual gathering. It's a big gathering. Everybody shows up. Everybody's talking about the success of Birthright. And let me tell you, Birthright is a huge success. There's no doubt in my mind. Let's do Birthright to young PhD candidates from Canada that are not necessarily Jewish. Let's call it PhD or postdoc Birthright. Let's bring them to the Hebrew U for a 10-day period, 2 weeks, to learn about the institution, to learn about Israel. This could be a game changer because these people will come back with a first-hand experience of Israel as a brand and the Hebrew University. So sometimes you don't do things only because they serve a specific purpose at that particular moment. You do things as part of a much larger strategy, which is to connect people to the Hebrew University experience. And the way you do that is by bringing groups that are not necessarily related today to the university, but hopefully will be related in the future. And I believe that the way to do it is to target PhD candidates or postdocs and just bring them for an introductory visit from Canada, especially now when the sentiment is so anti-Israel and so anti-Western on many of the campuses in Canada. So Israeli society is extremely diverse. We have over 80 languages regularly spoken in Israel, from Yiddish to Ladino to Amharic. We have 120 different ethnic groups represented. Israel is the only Western country that went into Africa to bring people not as slaves, the only Western country to do so. We went into Ethiopia in 2 different operations to bring newcomers from Ethiopia. And of course, when you go to the Hebrew University, as I do, you see also Arab Israelis, you see Palestinians from Judea and Samaria. You see people from all walks of life, Jews and non-Jews. I give an annual talk at the School of Public Policy, and I had a wonderful experience a couple of years ago with Ukrainian students, not Jewish, that were rescued by the Friends of the Hebrew University and given a scholarship to study. And in fact, one of them are right now in Canada, working in Canada in Calgary, one of the best students in this class. But what's interesting about that, and I'd like to share this with our viewers, is that we had a group of about 7 Palestinian students from Judea and Samaria, and we had a few Jewish kids that came from the San Francisco Bay Area. And I started my talk because it was a class about the basic rules of philanthropy by telling the story of who built the Hebrew University, right? And I used the word Zionism several times to explain that the people that built the university did it because they were Zionists, including Albert Einstein, who was a self-proclaimed Zionist. And the Jewish students at one point exploded. How dare you be so insensitive? Use the word Zionism in front of the Palestinians. Palestinians couldn't care less. It was the Jews that were bothered by the fact that I mentioned the word Zionism, which is a bad word, sadly. What is a Zionist? A Zionist is a person who believes that the Jews have a right to be independent. That's a Zionist. Martin Luther King was a Zionist. Winston Churchill was a Zionist. Albert Einstein was a Zionist. Harry Belafonte was a Zionist. And I can go on and on and on. So the diversity is visible. You can actually touch it. When you walk the corridors and the classes of the Hebrew U, you can touch it. You can see it. And I think it's a big strength of the university. An interesting point of comparison. In Israel, we don't have those so-called DEI programs. DEI, diversity, equality, and inclusion, started as a good idea. Who can be against more diversity? Who can be against more equality? Who can be against inclusion? Nobody. Somehow, in some universities, it became twisted so that in the name of inclusion, they exclude Jewish students. We've seen that in Harvard. We've seen that in Columbia and other places. And I think that even here in Canada, when you see what happened in other universities, you don't have that in Israel, where diversity actually is serving a valuable social purpose. Here, the DEI apparatus is reminding people, students, of their differences all the time. Instead of celebrating what they have in common, they're highlighting their differences in the name of inclusion. You don't have all that bureaucracy in Israel. And so I think people feel a lot more comfortable on campus in Jerusalem when it comes to diversity. And I think that every friend of the university should be extremely proud of the fact that the university is serving so many different eclectic groups and is giving a chance. This is really the whole idea behind equality. We cannot guarantee equality of outcome. There is no institution in the world that can say, I can guarantee that you will be a success story. Nobody can. What you can do is guarantee equality of opportunity, which is what the Hebrew University is doing. And to mind you, for very, very small tuition, which is a fraction of what you're paying in North America. When we look at the future, we don't know a lot of things, but we do know several things. The first is we know that life expectancy is going to go up. In fact, there's a whole branch in science that says let's look at aging as a disease, and at least theoretically speaking, once you look at aging as a disease, then at least theoretically there's a cure, could be a cure. So that's one thing that we know, that life expectancy is going to go up. The second thing that we know is that global population is going to increase from 7.5 billion today to 10 billion by 2050. We also know that most people will live in major cities. We know that in Israel, the population is going to grow from 10 million to about 18, 19 million by 2050. So the pool of talent is only going to grow. It's going to be a larger pool of talent. This pool of talent will live longer. And this pool of talent, considering machine learning, which is really what AI is all about, and quantum computing, which is incredibly powerful calculations that right now computers are unable to do, will be able to, and not to mention the advent of nanotechnology that will allow us to create new materials that will be resilient way more than we can imagine, right? So consider all of those factors together, and you'll understand that the Hebrew University will have to work from a much larger, wider, stronger pool of talent. And I think that's a recipe for great success. So remember, there'll be more Israelis. They'll live longer. They'll have unprecedented tools to deploy for the purpose of their science and the research, machine learning, quantum computing. So the sky is the limit, nanotechnology. The sky is the limit. And so I foresee, and the Hebrew University has a great advantage because it's already established itself as a global leader in science. It's like the Harvard of Israel, right? It has a built-in advantage. So I see a bright future 100 years from now to the Hebrew University. Reality is more complex than we think. We need to engage in a nuanced conversation and to be aware of the fact that the algorithm is viciously and mercilessly pushing us to adopt a binary view of reality. It's plus versus minus, black versus white. If you're not with me, you're against me. You see that in politics, vicious politics today, all over the world. You see that in the rise of populism. You see that in the rise of anti-state populism. What is anti-state populism? It's when the political leader, the elected political leader, is working against the institution of his government or her government. It's like an autoimmune disease. So my message is learn to cope with complexity. Do not shy away from debates. Do not shy away from arguments. Arguments is at the heart of creativity. Creativity cannot exist without self-criticism. Creativity cannot exist with censorship. Look at what's happening with Russia as opposed to what's happening in Silicon Valley or what's happening in Israel. So Israeli universities in general do not experience the same kind of anti-Semitism, and what we're seeing in the Western world, especially North America, US, and Canada, is a new type of anti-Semitism that is being carried by Muslims mostly, where in the past it was mostly by the Christian right, by white supremacists and so on. Now it's more Muslims, and the reason is because they're being taught from cradle that Israel is a Satan, that America is a Satan. It didn't prevent them from exploiting the opportunities North America is giving them. And you see them here in universities in Canada and in universities in the rest of the Western world. The university can do two things. The first is to study it, because it's a mystery. How come the Jews are only 0.2% of global population, meaning 1/5 of 1% of global population? And yet they've been accused of trying to rule the world in every generation. By the way, it's the only form of hatred, the only form of racism that is about accusing a group of trying to rule the world. It's the only group that is being repeatedly accused. When they are rich, they're being accused. When they are poor, they're being accused. Even when they were enslaved, they were being accused of trying to rule the world. They were accused of inventing communism, and they were accused of inventing capitalism. They're accused of everything. And the answer is because they are the ultimate universal other. Anti-Semitism is a sign of a societal sickness, as Martin Luther King said, just like any other form of racism. The fact that it's there, it means the society is sick. People feel bad about their lives. People feel bad about themselves. People feel that they're underachievers, and they're looking for someone to blame, because the most difficult thing is to blame ourselves. So the first thing universities can do is to study this. The second thing is, and that's where the Hebrew University, I think, can have a global leadership role, is to put together a global university task force to set the rules, to write guidelines, to create a protocol, just like we have, even the most inconceivable situation like battle, war. There are rules accepted by the international community as to how you fight a war. It's called the Geneva Convention. And we need something similar about code of conduct online with hate speech in general, because not everything is protected under free speech. And we need to do that together with the academic prestige of the Hebrew University. And I think that Israeli universities must be part of that conversation. I know that there's an effort to create such a network of universities in North America, and I think that the Hebrew U should be leading the way. There's no doubt in my mind. How do you behave? What what constitutes of anti-Semitism? What is the difference between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism? By the way, in my view, none whatsoever. There's no difference. It's the same. Brands in crisis, and Israel is certainly in crisis, need to do several things. The first is be transparent as much as you can, and that is meant to restore trust. The second is to communicate, communicate, and communicate. There are times, especially in times of crisis, where you have to communicate. You don't hold back. You have to manage the crisis. But at the same time, you have to be able, and that's the third element, to think long term, to think strategically and implement strategy. As long as the conversation about Israel, and here the Hebrew University is doing a phenomenal work, as long as the conversation about Israel is focusing only on Israel's problems, nothing good is going to come out of it. Why? Because there are two golden rules in marketing. The first is know for yourself what is your own competitive edge. What makes you unique? What is your special offering to the consumer? Right? That's the number rule in marketing. Number one rule in marketing. Las Vegas, for example, is offering fantasy. Right? The fantasy to be rich, the fantasy to be, I don't know what. That's their offering. Once you figure that out, the second rule is to be able to deliver that competitive edge, that relative advantage, effectively communicate that to the audiences that are relevant to your message. Don't send it all over the world. Send it to the people that care about it, right? It's impossible for a brand to thrive by constantly talking about its problems. The State of Israel as a brand should celebrate the success of the Hebrew U, should celebrate the success of the scientists of the Hebrew U, should celebrate the success and the commitment and the devotion of the supporters of the Hebrew U. That's what we should in order to boost the brand. Because at the end of the day, and many of my neighbors where I live work at the Hebrew U. My neighbors, at the end of the day, it's a story of ordinary people achieving extraordinary things. That's the story. And people can connect with that. People can relate to that. People don't relate to policies. Policies don't make people feel good about it. But when you hear a personal story, when you hear a scientist, how he or she achieved a breakthrough, and what is the actual meaning of their breakthrough to humanity, it connects people in a very big way. So the brand has to be humanized. The Hebrew University can play a huge role in humanizing, putting a human face on Israel as a brand. I think that the Canadian jury, which I've been exposed to since 10/7, has been phenomenally supportive of Israel. I think that what they should do is continue to do the same. Support whenever you can. I wouldn't get involved in domestic Israeli politics. It's not advisable. I've seen some Jews who did get involved, and the reason why I say that is because the Israeli politics very complicated. Unless you live there, unless you send your kid to the army, I wouldn't get involved. I wouldn't get involved. It's like being a Monday night quarterback, right? It's very easy to give advice from the sidelines, but once you're there and you're involved and you send your kids to the army and you're in bed when the ballistic missiles are coming in from Yemen or from Iran, it puts you in a different position. But the support has been incredible, not only financially, but also morally. I've seen the leadership of the Canadian Friends in just about every major city in Canada, and I'm deeply impressed by the commitment, by the devotion, by the love of Israel and the love of the Hebrew University. There are two very important points that we have to discuss in order to understand that big, epic misunderstanding between Israel and the international community. The first is the issue of who are we fighting? In the eyes of the world, of the vast majority of what we call open, liberal, progressive democracies, Israel is fighting Hamas, a small organization, about 50,000 people. And while they admit that the massacre was incomprehensible and brutal, they think that Israel's response is disproportionate, as they say. Right? That's the prevailing perception among people that follow the news and are part of those liberal democracies. But that's not how Israel sees it. If in their eyes Israel is fighting a small terrorist organization, mighty Israel with 10 million people, with one of the strongest armies in the world, with a mighty economy, is fighting 50,000 Hamas people, then Hamas clearly is the underdog, right? That's not how the Israelis see that. The Israelis see that as we're fighting a rogue entity, political entity called Gaza, governed by Hamas. But the enemy is Gaza, not Hamas. Just as the enemy of the Allied forces in World War II was Germany and not the Nazi Party. And at the end, Germany was defeated and not just the Nazi Party was defeated. So that's the first source to that epic misunderstanding. Right? The Israelis see themselves as fighting an entire political system, an entire society that is supporting Hamas. Hamas is only the governing body of Gaza. The second source of the misunderstanding comes actually from academic thought of post-World War II. World War II was a major, devastating event in the history of humanity. 60 million people died between 1939 to 1945, which was at the time population of 2.5 billion. It's like today losing 180 million people in one war. Can you imagine? That's what happened to humanity. And as a result, the United States, that really introduced the New World Order and created the United Nations in 1945 in San Francisco, the United States embraced a new conversation. Human rights became the biggest thing. Jean-Paul Sartre, a French existentialist, expressed around that time the view that if you see yourself as a good person, you must see the world through the eyes of the underdog. And it was appropriate at the time when the world was exposed to such suffering. Even the most twisted mind could not have imagined that the Germans will deploy an industrial extinction machine for the Jews with precision and efficiency unmatched. So the world was under the severe trauma. Now, what started as a good idea, just like DI, started as a good idea. Let's be compassionate to the underdog, which also corresponds with our human nature. We feel good when we're providing help to the needy, when we're helping the defenseless and the helpless, like a baby or puppy. It makes us feel good biologically, psychologically. So it went from let's see the world through the eyes of the underdog, which was a noble idea. It became the underdog is always right. The underdog is never accountable. So the same people that look at Hamas and they say, yeah, they did something horrible. But come on, they're only 50,000 people. They are clearly the underdog. And our job is to tell them the underdog can be brutal. The underdog can be wrong. And the underdog must be held accountable. Must be held accountable. That's the whole story right there. That's what you're seeing on campus. So there's a whole intellectual school of thought that started after World War II in philosophy, in law, certainly in gender studies and in sociology and social anthropology, that is looking at the weak in society. I call it the purity of the underdog concept. They're always pure just by the fact that they are disadvantaged, that they are weak. And if you ask me, there's some benefits to this approach. It's always good to be compassionate. I mean, the Judeo-Christian heritage is all about being compassionate. But you have to draw the lines. And this is what we're seeing today all over the world. There's another dimension that should be mentioned, that many people experienced a certain silence after 10/7. People that we felt that should have called and asked, how you doing, didn't call. And it bothered me, and I wanted to know why. What was the source of that silence? And I realized after a while that the source of the silence was that many people felt that 10/7 happened and that Israel could have done more to prevent it by way of providing the Palestinians more concessions. What's behind this thinking is the belief that 10/7 is part of the national conflict between Israelis and Palestinians. The 10/7 is part of that clashing narratives, clashing national narratives. But Hamas, and this is the failure of that approach, Hamas is not representing the Palestinian national interest. In fact, when you think about what Hamas is doing, their conduct is certainly since they took over Gaza, first in the elections in January of 2006, and then when they kicked out Fatah in 2007, very brutally, by the way. Hamas is not interested at all in the well-being of the Palestinians. So Hamas is not about Palestinian statehood. There is no compromise to be reached with Hamas. Hamas is not about negotiating with Israel a deal that will, once and for all solve the Palestinian problem. So this is the failure of that approach. 10/7 is not part of the Israeli-Palestinian national conflict. It is part of the West's war against global jihad. That's the whole misunderstanding on that issue. I'm very optimistic because I know the history. Two things to be said. The first is Israel bounced after every major geopolitical challenge, and the economy spiked, university thrives. It's true, by the way, that after every major military confrontation, there's a wave of young Israelis that leave the country. Always. The biggest wave per capita, per the number of people, was actually after 1948. 1948 was a very difficult war because unlike today, Israel did not have resources. Israel had to rely on volunteers. Some of them were Canadians. One of the most famous Canadian volunteers was not even Jewish. His name was George Buzz Burling. George Buzz Burling was a famous, almost a celebrity pilot from World War II, and he joined the Israeli army to help the Israelis to build their new air force. Unfortunately, he died in action in Rome in 1948, and he's buried in Haifa. So those of you, my friends, the Canadians who are visiting Israel, go and visit this Canadian war hero that gave his life for Israel's independence. But he wasn't the only one. There were many Canadians that volunteered. So what gives me optimism is the fact that Israel always bounced back after every challenge. The second reason why I'm optimistic is because on October 8th, we witnessed the younger generation of Israelis. We saw them in action, and they were incredible. I know that there's a lot of criticism in North America about Gen Z, how they're spoiled, they want to stay in their parents' homes, they don't want to work, they want to be a lot of criticism. Some of it is is accurate, some of it is an exaggeration. But in any event, in Israel, they're different. Maybe it's because of the military service. Maybe it's because of the access that they have to the peer group. Maybe because of the way you grow up in Israel is different. You have more unsupervised playtime in Israel. My kids used to just go out and play. And Israel, believe it or not, I know it sounds crazy, is much safer than most urban centers in North America. So I would let my kid go out and play in my neighborhood with no supervision, which is something I would never do in New York, right? So maybe that made the Israeli kids different, but they're more mature, they're more responsible. I think they understand complexity, and I see them and I say to myself, God, what an incredible generation. So we've been blessed. So I became the head of Israel's brand management team in 2006, 2007. My dear friend Amir Gissin, who was my partner in creating the foundation for Brand Israel, was just appointed as Israel's consul general in Toronto. And I basically created that new position of the head of Israel's brand management team. One of the first things that I learned, and I'm ashamed to say that I had no idea, is that Albert Einstein left his entire archives of 80,000 documents to the Hebrew U. To me, it was clear that we have to build a proper museum for this. And so I included that in the national plan that I wrote for Israel as a brand. And I included in that plan that the Hebrew University must be the partner for that endeavor because they own the archives. I actually reached out to the president of the State of Israel, Shimon Peres at the time. The year was 2008. And Shimon Peres loved the idea. When I met Rami Kleinman, the head of Canadian Friends of Hebrew U, he introduced me to the cabinet secretary at the time. It was a 1 a.m. meeting across the street from the Dan Hotel in Tel Aviv when I met Tzvi Hauser. And the year was 2009, I believe. It's when Mr. Netanyahu went back to the prime minister's office, maybe 2010. And I introduced the idea to Tzvika Hauser, who really fell in love with it, of building a museum, and he prepared a decision for the Israeli government to pass. The Israeli government passed the decision in 2012, but nothing happened because they weren't willing to put the money. So I kind of gave up. And so when I retired from government in 2016, I started working with a very famous art collector in New York. His name is Jose Mugrabi. And I remember Rami Kleinman calling me and saying to me, do you think that Mugrabi maybe will be interested in the Einstein project? And I said to him, you know what, it's a good idea. He's a collector. He understands the importance of artifacts, is quick to understand. In fact, Mr. Mugrabi, in many ways, is some kind of a genius when it comes to artifacts and identifying the value of objects. He can look at two paintings and tell you which one is going to be worth more than the other. It's incredible. So I sat with him in his office in 2017, and I told him the story about how Albert Einstein founded the Hebrew U, and how the whole world was expecting him to leave everything to Princeton, to the Applied Sciences Institute, which he was part of, and everybody was shocked when he left everything to the Hebrew U, and that it's largely in storage in some building in Jerusalem. And he was blown away. He said, what? What are you telling me? That Albert Einstein's archive is in storage? He and his wife, Mary, they recruited famous architect Daniel Lipskin. They put together a beautiful plan. We broke ground about a year and a half ago in Jerusalem. Right now, they're starting the actual building process. There's no doubt in my mind that the Albert Einstein Museum in Jerusalem on campus will be a major attraction for tourists. The Canadian Friends played a critical role in security. It's not only the fact that it was Rami Kleiman's idea that I will approach Mr. Mugrabi, but also the Canadian Friends prepared a beautiful album for Mr. Mugrabi about the legacy of Albert Einstein and his connection to the Hebrew U. And we came especially to New York to present the album to Mr. Mugrabi. This was all the work of the Canadian Friends, and the beautiful album was designed by the great Laurie Metrick. And I'm sure some of you have heard of him. So that's the story, and I think it's important that the Canadian Friends know that they played a critical role in creating this museum. For me, it's just a passion project. I know that the Mr. Mugrabi is a great Zionist, is a extremely philanthropic, and together with his wife Mary and their beautiful family, they're building a legacy that will last forever. So Brand Einstein is very similar to Brand Israel. In what way? There's a very interesting relationship and synergy even between the two. Both of them represent creativity, boundless creativity, and in both cases, the offering of the brand, meaning what is the proposal, what is the brand proposition, what are we offering you, the consumer, is inspiration. What's inspiring about Einstein is the fact that he achieved all the amazing scientific achievements without any financial backing, without any organizational support. He used what we call thought experiments. He used his imagination. Think about what this says to children in Africa or in India that feel that they have no chance because they don't have resources. And you tell them, here's the story of Albert Einstein, who sat under a tree and imagined time and imagined relativity, used his imagination for all those incredible scientific breakthroughs that later on were also validated scientifically with formulas. Israel is also inspirational. Take a country that was born out of the ashes of the Holocaust. Again, defenseless and helpless. Nobody gave Israel a chance. You know that Life magazine sent a crew of reporters to cover the 1948 war. And in the issue of Life magazine that came out at the end of May of 1948, they concluded that the modern state of Israel is just an experiment, and the experiment is doomed to fail. That was the prevailing perception. No one gave Israel a chance. People don't remember that because we take Israel for granted today. But in 1948, no one gave Israel a chance. And so it's the same source of inspiration. So I think that it's only appropriate to have the place that will display Albert Einstein's not only documents but also personal belongings. You're going to have his own private album collection. What's the music that Albert Einstein listened to? Well, it's interesting. You're going to have his little desk, his little study there. This will be extremely inspirational, especially for younger people.